right. Welcome everyone. My name is Katie. I'm delighted to be with you all today, and here with my colleague Ethan Snyder to hear about etching with Esherick. I was telling him before we opened this up that I feel like I'm going to learn a lot today because we all know him as a woodcut artist. So what is this etching business all about? Um, for any of you who haven't been on a spotlight talk with us before, what we'll do is listen to Ethan. He's got some wonderful slides put together for about 20-25 minutes. And then at the end, we'll open it up for any questions or comments. We ask that you keep yourselves muted while the program is happening, just so that we can all hear Ethan's talk. And then at the end, you can unmute yourself to ask questions. Or if you're having thoughts bubble up while the program's happening and you want to drop them into the chat, we can kind of address them at the end. So stay with us until the end. We'll also talk to you about some upcoming programs we have later this summer. In the next Spotlight Talk, we've got some great stuff on the horizon. But with that, I will turn it over to you, Ethan.
Right, fantastic. And I'll be really curious to hear from everyone after the talk's over what your thoughts are about this etching. I might offer a value judgment or two, but I'm always curious what other people think as well. So let me get my screen shared. Let me pop over to the slides. All right. And everyone can see my slides all right? Perfect. All right. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this month's Spotlight Talk from the Wharton Esherick Museum. My name is Ethan Snyder, and I'm the museum's manager of collections and public programming. So today we are going to be covering a topic that I think that we can always stand to learn a little more about, which is Wharton Esherick as a printmaker. So the Crafted World of Wharton Esherick exhibition that's been traveling the country since last fall of 24, has garnered a new and exciting interest around Wharton Esherick's prints. The Crafted World exhibition has brought dozens and dozens of the artist's beautiful graphic prints to the public to enjoy. And the interests that these prints have received reminds me, and I think all of us at the museum, that very few prints and blocks are actually exhibited on site, and that Wharton Esherick's early practice as a printmaker is apt to be overshadowed by the very wonderful furniture and sculpture that he has become so well known for. So Esherick practiced printmaking from the very early 1920s through the 1930s, and would even strike new editions of his prints with his own press later into life in the late 1960s before his death in 1970. Esherick primarily practiced carving wood engravings, and his prints illustrated on a number of books, appeared in very popular magazines such as Century, The Dial, The Forum, Vanity Fair, you name it. And they were also exhibited across the country at art galleries, art clubs, and museums. And here's a selection of some of my favorite prints from Esherick on the screen. So Esherick first took up printmaking when he met the writer Mary Marcy in Fairhope, Alabama during the winter of 1919 into 1920, while he and Letty were working at the Fairhope Organic School of Education, which was run by the educator Merida Johnson, whose photo we see here on the left side of the screen from a wonderful old Esherick family photo album. And Mary Marcy approached Esherick because she was writing a book of rhymes for children about the controversial topic of evolution. I'm sure that this is not an unfamiliar story to everyone. And Marcy invited Esherick to collaborate with her, and he made over 100 woodblocks to illustrate her publication. And at this point in time, while Esherick was working on these woodblocks, he was still an active painter and had really just begun the practice of carving his own frames. So at this point, carving is pretty new to Wharton Esherick, but he's getting, he's cutting his teeth on frames and woodblocks and things like that. So in the months and years that followed, Esherick took up carving antique furniture, like this beautiful blanket chest we see on the left, as well as some of the new furniture that he began to build. And on the right, we see this beautiful drop leaf desk that Esherick carved for his wife Letty in 1926. So presumably Esherick was using the same tools to carve and engrave his woodblocks and wood engravings as he was to carve his frames and later to carve his antique and new furniture as well. So we can think about Wharton's carving as one continual practice that went across multiple different media. And once Esherick got back to Pennsylvania from Fairhope, Alabama, he acquired himself a mid-19th century Washington press from the Pottstown Mercury in about 1921. Um, he first printed blocks using spoons and rolling pins at home. And once he acquired this press, he was extremely lucky because it was quite rare for a printmaker to own their own press. And it meant that Wharton could print at will, and he did not have to rely on a printer who probably would have had many other clients to be working with. And I want to point out on the left side of the screen here this photo from 1930 of the studio and the printing press kind of hidden in the darkness on this side. So Esherick appears to have also experimented with a couple of different printmaking processes beyond woodblock printing and wood engraving. First one is etching, which we'll be talking about today. And at some point in the late 19 teens or early 1920s, also experimented with stencil printing as well. And these are some of the stencils on the screen here that Esherick would have cut himself from paper. And I think that that's quite neat that we have these as well. And you'll notice when we compare some of these stencils to some of Esherick's later prints that you'll kind of get the idea that some of these stencils may have been precursors for prints that Esherick was able to later realize in blocks as well. So the Wharton Esherick Museum is very lucky to steward a single example of the artist's work in etching, which is what we see here on the screen. There may be a few more etchings from Wharton Esherick in the world somewhere, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So the etching on the screen here in our collection is titled View from a Window. It's probably from just about 1920. And I say that there may be more etchings from Esherick out there because the example that we're looking at here is likely the result of a very short stint of experimenting with the medium after Wharton was approached by the organic school's headmaster, Merida Johnson, to make a printing plate of a diploma that the school could use to give to graduates. So, in the process of trying to figure out how to make a printing plate of a diploma, I'm led to believe that Esherick may have experimented with some other plates, and this could be the result of that experimentation. And that etching was just one of a few projects that Esherick did for the community in Fairhope, Alabama, including what we see here on the screen, which are these two wonderful book plates that Esherick made for the Fairhope Public Library. So when it comes to talking about etchings, I think it's important to understand that during this period, when Esherick was just getting used to relief carving, that etching would have likely presented itself as kind of a wholly different ballgame to the artist. Woodblock carving and wood engraving are both called relief processes, which means that they share something in common. And that's that you carve away the surface of a block, and the resulting raised areas like that, like we see here on the screen, are going to be the pieces that are inked and then printed. And etching is something that is almost the opposite. So etching, on the other hand, is a form of intaglio printing, which is a process that involves both manual and chemical work. So etchings are made by covering a copper or metal plate in an acid-resistant material like a varnish or a wax. And then you make your design by scratching into the wax with an etching needle. And once you've etched away or scratched away your design on the plate, you take it, you dip it into a vat of acid, and then all of the places where you've scratched your design into are going to be eaten away so that you're left with recesses for the ink to sit in and later print. So here on the bottom left of the screen, I have this little diagram that shows a relief block, and you can see that, what's getting printed is in relief versus an intaglio block, like an etching plate here, where the ink is actually going to sit in recesses before it gets printed. So when looking at an etching, and we're looking at Esherick's here, you're going to notice some characteristic markings that come from this process. So at the bottom of the screen, I have kind of cropped the bottom of this print and the paper, and you'll notice that the etching plate actually leaves an impression on the paper. And whenever you see a print with that kind of impression, it's a pretty good guess that that would be left from an etching plate. Additionally, you'll notice that the printed image itself is mainly made up of a variety of lines from scratching away at that plate with that etching needle. And Esherick was able to kind of achieve variations in light and shade by poking dots onto the plate or through very, very close parallel lines or cross hatchings like we're seeing here. So we can see when comparing Esherick's etching with this wonderful example by James McNeill Whistler called The Lime Burner from 1859, that both of these prints display a similar method of cross-hatching and scratching in parallel lines to create the shadows through different kinds of textures. And of course, these are, two very different types of prints and executions. But here we'll see some detailed cropping images from the McNeill print. And you can see here in the middle all of these very close and cross-hatched lines to create this shadow, as well as up here on the roof line as well. And that's some really detailed work in comparison to what we're seeing out of Wharton Esherick just starting out with the medium. So considering that the window in this image, the window frame, the window sill, and then what I think here, which must be a candlestick, are all quite heavily shaded in this kind of cross-hatching, I'm led to believe that Wharton must have sketched this scene from life while sitting inside in front of a window and working by natural light. So we see a building depicted here outside the window that's just roughed out and a couple scratches here and there, versus these really heavy lines that we see making up the interior. So hence, I'm led to believe that the window, the candlestick are all kind of backlit against a sunny day outside that Wharton is working with from the window. And having completed this etching, Esherick, of course, signs the plate at the very bottom corner, like we see here. It's hard to see, but you can make out a WHE. So when, we're looking at this etching, maybe someone is confused about whether it is indeed a Wharton Esherick, we can confirm with his signature right there that he made this. So this was Esherick's first time experimenting with the medium. And as a good collaborator like Wharton Esherick was, he knew that he needed some guidance in order to make an etching. Luckily, one of the other people that was wintering down in Fairhope, Alabama, and was becoming a close friend of Wharton and Letty was a gentleman named Carl Zigrosser, who is a budding connoisseur of etchings and the new manager of the Weyhe Gallery in New York City that dealt in contemporary prints. Zigrosser was in Fairhope with his wife Florence King, who he called Kinglet, and their daughter Corolla. So the Zigrosser family, according to one of Carl's many autobiographies, went down to Fairhope in March 1920 to escape a particularly harsh winter in New York City. Florence King, like Letty and Wharton, was also involved in Marietta Johnson's school, and she was also known to be the typist for their mutual friend and famed American author Sherwood Anderson, who is another one of the seasonal guests in Fairhope, Alabama. Carl Zigrosser was a pivotal figure in changing Americans' taste for prints from a kind of Victorian and old master inclination towards what we would call today as modern art. So Zigrosser began his career at the Keppel Gallery, and we see an extant catalog from our collection from the Keppel Gallery where Esherick must have visited in 1913. And during his time at the Keppel Gallery, Zigrosser was becoming more and more familiar with prints made by contemporary European artists like Edgar Degas, Edouard Manet, Camille Pissarro, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, Marie Cassatt, and many others. And he found that the management at Keppel didn't really believe that there would be an audience for this kind of experimental printmaking at their gallery. So the Weyhe Gallery opens in 1919 as an offshoot of the Weyhe bookstore that had been selling antiquarian and artist books for some time. And the store's owner, Erhard Weyhe, had actually approached Zigrosser about managing a print shop that would be next door to the bookstore. And this print shop, as Zigrosser recalled in one of his biographies, was kind of tailored towards, quote, the artist or collector of moderate means but good taste. So presumably, Zigrosser wanted to be able to sell prints that everyday people could afford, and he was quite famous for selling $5 prints at the gallery, among other kind of more expensive works. So Carl Zigrosser managed the Weyhe Gallery from 1919 all the way until 1940. And at the Weyhe Gallery, he was truly able to try out his budding ideas about contemporary art, collecting, exhibiting, and selling, plus championing, I should say, works by living artists in North America, Central America, and Europe. Zigrosser even spearheaded Weyhe Gallery's 1922 publication called The Living Artist, which implored readers to, quote, buy the works of the creators of your time. Aid them when they need your support the most, not when they are old and famous. And Zigrosser was just lucky enough to be living amongst some very, very important contemporary artists who would then become, like Wharton Esherick, the old and famous artists that we know today. So Carl Zigrosser and Esherick actually ran in similar circles, and Esherick's close friend, Henry Varnum Poor, who is a potter, was hired to tile the entire facade of the Weyhe Gallery, and we can see that tiling here in a couple of the Christmas cards that were made and sent out by the Weyhe Gallery every year. The one on the left here, and we can see the tiling is made by Emile Ganso, and this Christmas card on the right from Howard Cook also shows this wonderful tiling along the outside. So to get back to Fairhope in 1920, it appears that when Marietta Johnson approached Wharton Esherick originally about the possibility of making an etching for the Fairhope Organic School's diplomas, Carl Zigrosser had unfortunately just left Fairhope to go back to New York City to manage the gallery for the warmer months. So his wife, however, Florence, stays in Alabama to continue working with Sherwood Anderson. And Wharton Esherick finds out through Florence that Carl Zigrosser knows a thing or two about etchings, and maybe they should talk. So, having never worked with an etching plate before, Esherick writes to Carl Zigrosser in New York City asking after supplies, technical advice, expertise, and also some other artists he might look into for inspiration. Esherick's letters to Zigrosser show us that this young artist was really eager to learn more about printmaking just as he was beginning this practice, and he was really eager to learn about other printmakers that were working at the time. So, as we'll hear in some of these letters, Esherick undoubtedly recognized that Carl Zigrosser was a connoisseur and dealer worth his salt, and that there was a lot to learn and maybe even some opportunities to be had through someone like him. So Esherick's first letter to Zigrosser reads as following, and I didn't put it on the screen because it's impossible to make out the gentleman's handwriting. But he says this: Mrs. Johnson wants me to make a plate of a diploma for the school. I've never done anything with plates before. Will you advise me what I need? Or in better words, if you know where the materials could be found, will you get them and send them to me with the bill? Florence says copper is high, but that is what the school has directed me to do. I will need a tool, acid and wax, and a plate 10 by 12. I want to work into this art, and now that the school is financing it, I'm going to cut loose. Can an ordinary printer get impressions from the plate? If this is putting you in too much trouble, just let me know to whom I could write for the materials and I will do it. Then Esherick asks Carl Zigrosser to also send him a copy of Rockwell Kent's Wilderness, and that exact copy we're seeing here on the screen, with the $5 bill that he had enclosed in his reply, along with some questions about recommendations for collections of Audrey Beardsley prints that Esherick might acquire and be able to study. Later, then, Esherick writes to Carl from Fairhope to let him know that, quote, the plates arrived in excellent condition. I hope to get on it soon. At present, and this is quite wonderful, we're up to our ears costuming the school for folk dances. Send me the bill for all the stuff you sent, and I will send you a check. But I must start making an attack on the school treasury. Then he goes on to write about Rockwell Kent's book and how the artist, and I included this because I think it's quite wonderful, quote, has done what is certainly needed in art. He has opened its window and let the fresh air in. I see he is influenced by Blake. I am not very familiar with William Blake's black and whites, so suggest some of his things to me. I want to look them up. Thank you again for your kindness and labor in securing me the etching stuff. Here's to hoping I don't make a botch of the job. So here's one of these letters with Wharton's kind of very difficult to make out handwriting. And at the bottom, and I cropped this out here, we can see the bill that was recorded for the needle, the varnish, the plates, the book packing, as well as the copy of Rockwell Kent's Wilderness, which ended up being $2.50 more than Wharton assumed it would be. So the above letters that we're looking at are actually at the University of Pennsylvania as part of the Carl Zigrosser collection. And what we're missing from some of these papers is, or are Carl Zigrosser's responses to Esherick. And instead of responding directly to Wharton, however, Carl Zigrosser instead writes to his wife, Florence, and these letters are copied into one of Carl Zigrosser's autobiographies. And this is what he tells Florence, his wife. I got a letter from Wharton asking me to get some etching paraphernalia for him. He does not realize how complex a medium etching is and how easy it is to spoil a plate. I don't think anyone could prepare a plate, laid on the ground and smoking, etc., without spoiling at least half a dozen. So I will get someone here to fix all that. Will you tell him that I am assembling the stuff, and as soon as I can get an etcher to fix it, I will send it down. So it seems like Carl was a little suspicious that Wharton was going to be able to do anything at all with these plates, but we at least get to see some of the product of these experiments. And unfortunately, we don't really have any documentation about how the rest of this run of plates turned out for Wharton, whether he worked on all of them, whether he spoiled all of them, whether he may have successfully produced a diploma or not, or if there are any other etchings by Esherick in existence. I do have an ask out to the Merida Johnson School in Fairhope, Alabama, to see if they have any of these diplomas in their archives, and hopefully we will be finding out more from them soon. So, as a champion of living artists, and in particular living printmakers, Carl Zigrosser played a really important role in helping contemporary artists establish themselves, and he really gave them a wonderful platform to exhibit and sell through the Weyhe Gallery. Zigrosser worked closely with artists like Rockwell Kent, Wharton Esherick, Edward Hopper, William Zorach, Rudolph Tamayo, Alfred Stieglitz, among so many other famous names that we know as household names today. And he was even known to have, and I say this with a grain of salt, that he kind of was a patron to these artists as well. Um, and we hear stories of him helping immigrant artists like Emil Ganso, whose print we saw earlier. And Carl Zigrosser gave this guy a weekly allowance so that he could give up baking, which he was doing full time and just printmaking at night, so that he could be a full-time printmaker and be living off of his prints until he didn't need kind of Carl Zigrosser's patronage and money anymore. And Zigrosser also introduced Wharton and Letty to other friends and important people in New York City, such as the director of the Whitney Studio Club, where Wharton would be exhibiting his prints in the months and years following. And we know that the Weyhe Gallery was selling Esherick's prints as early as June 1923, just a couple years after Esherick and Carl Zigrosser first met. And what we're seeing here on the screen is a wonderful little receipt and letter written from Carl Zigrosser to Letty Esherick, telling her that Wharton had sold, this many prints, and there's a check for $33.60 enclosed for the sales. And in April 1927, Weyhe was inviting Esherick to have his first and ever solo show at the gallery. And we see here the exhibition pamphlet where Esherick was actually invited to create prints to adorn this kind of catalog and checklist. Although he wasn't actually invited to display or exhibit any of his prints at this show, it was solely a show of sculpture. And among some of the pieces that people would have seen at the Weyhe Gallery in April 1927 were sculptures like Berceuse, Muse, the Firebird Petitza, Cat and Snake, and the Race, some of which we see here on the screen. So, exhibiting and selling sculpture was a kind of secondary focus for the Weyhe Gallery, and their kind of business of selling prints and sculptures often intermingled, such that when you were invited to a formal print show, you would also likely be seeing sculptures displayed around the gallery for sale as well. And here we see another one of these really wonderful Christmas cards that was sent out from the Weyhe Gallery. This one made by the artist Mabel Dwight, who is a contemporary of Esherick. And I show this print because it gives us an idea of what the inside of Weyhe Gallery might have looked like, with books on shelves, prints on the wall, sculptures out and about, and these patrons kind of paging through things and looking closely at the things that are displayed around. So it appears that Esherick was selling a mix of prints, sculptures, and book through his time working with the Weyhe Gallery through the second half of the 1930s. And he kept Zigrosser and the Weyhe Gallery in mind, even during the busiest times of his career, such as during the Curtis Bach Commission in the mid 1930s. And I think that this is quite telling. So, in the midst of this project, where Esherick was managing dozens of employees, engineers, for an entire home remodel, he writes to Carl Zigrosser saying that he hoped that he could make more prints in the future and bring more sculpture up to the Weyhe Gallery if, quote, I ever get finished with sculpture and interior decorating. So it seems like Esherick kind of struggled to get back to printmaking until the very tail end of the 1960s, but it was something that he was really interested in getting back to, if only time were to allow it. So in conclusion, this one single etching really opens up some important aspects of Esherick's work as a young printmaker. His experiments, the artists that he was interested in, the relationships that helped get him established as a printmaker in the 1920s and 1930s that ultimately led him to be exhibiting, to be having his prints included in major publications, and so on and so forth. And it reminds us, too, that Esherick's story is not just built from wood and stone and mortar, but it includes details of things like copper plates and acid baths and the art of paper cutting as well. Um, and it is really interesting to me that, through this etching, we learn that Esherick never left printmaking behind due to a lack of interest or a distaste for the medium, but really only due to a lack of time and opportunity to make prints. And what we know from some of his later restrikes that are in our collection Esherick wouldn't get back to striking prints until at least 1964, likely around the time that he was reaching the age where he had to kind of take a step back from working at the bandsaw, handling lumber there, and towards more of a designer and that kind of a work. So, without further ado, I can open things up for questions, go back to different slides if people want to take a closer look at things. Um, but that wraps it up for the talk for today.
Thank you
So,
so much, Ethan.
yeah, so I
That-
figured now's the time to ask, what do people think about this etching?
It looks like a first etching or an early attempt, right? It's like not as sophisticated as his, but that's my opinion. Not as sophisticated as his woodcuts by
Yeah,
a stretch. It
yeah,
makes me wonder if he really, when you were talking about the differences in the processes and you're talking about Carl Zigrosser's like kind of, he's a little concerned for Esherick that he's not going to be able to approach it um on his own without like more guidance. And it's a really, and part of what can be really nice about printmaking is that it's really like removed from the final product. Like there's all of these steps, and I found myself wondering if it just felt too removed from the immediacy of like making something, and the way that like when you think about a woodcut block, you're working directly with what that image is going to be. Or even with like his sculpture, he is like would always want to be a direct carver, right? So it's not like he's interested in casting or interested in like, I mean, he does that when he wants to keep a version, but he's not like doing that himself. So, it just as a process, it really is a different thing.
yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
So I see a question in the chat from Lisa about the Crafted World. So yeah, you're correct that it's currently in Cincinnati. And the Taft Museum of Art is unfortunately the exhibition's last stop. So in September, we will be welcoming the collection back home to the studio. And plans are still taking shape around that, but we will be sure to give people a little bit more heads up and some guidance around what the studio will be looking like after September. And then I see, oh, the question about the birds on the door on the wall. So let me pull my slides back up so I can show everyone what Lisa's asking about. So Lisa is pointing us towards this old image of the studio. We'll find it. Here we go, to the left. And these are eagles that Esherick carved into his loading doors. I'm not really sure why Esherick chose eagles to carve into the door, but we know that this was a motif that he played around with pretty frequently. And even in a desk that Esherick made for the Curtis Bach Commission, 9 years after he carved these loading doors, he was still working in these eagle motifs when he could. And if I'm not mistaken, we see similar bird motifs here in Letty's dropleaf desk that are carved as well.
I always wonder, Ethan, if it's not because he saw them.
Yeah,
I've
absolutely.
seen a lot. I see a lot of hawks, but I've seen eagles around the studio too. So
Yeah. Oh, and we have those prints of turkey buzzards and things like that as well. Absolutely.
Ethan was having spent time in Esherick's bedroom lately through with the events. I've just had lots of opportunity to look at his books. So Durer, I don't know how you say that, Albrecht Durer, was he a big influence on Esherick? Would he have looked at his etchings and any detail on what his thoughts on Durer's art?
Yeah, I'm not the correct type of art historian to like answer that confidently. I would say that Wharton, increasingly, we are understanding that Wharton really engaged with the books that he had um, on site in his bedroom. And knowing a little bit about the history of etching, it seems like that medium went through a real heyday with people like Durer, and then it kind of became more of a medium to reproduce paintings and things like that so that, you could make a postcard of a famous painting and sell that, and that would likely be an etching. And then at some point, during the mid 19th century, Europe and America went through a veritable like etching revival. And that's when the medium starts to get a little bit more creative, where people are making new things rather than just reproductive art from it. Yeah, and also now that you mentioned the bedroom, if people can remember, there's this wonderful Daumier print that's in Wharton's bedroom, and the original version of that, I'm led to believe, was actually a gift from Zigrosser that was sent directly from his gallery. Yeah. So please feel free to follow up with me with any follow-up questions. You can reach us at info@whartonesherickmuseum.org, or you can email me directly at ethan@whartonesherickmuseum.org. And we'll be sure to be compiling some information related to this talk to send with the follow-up, such as blog posts, other spotlight talks that might touch on some of this stuff. So we'll be sending everyone some more things to parse through.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ethan. I'm just curious, the tiniest thing, but have you read the biography or the autobiography, is it, of Carl Zigrosser?
I've read one and a half of them. He has two.
Oh, okay. So he wrote two autobiographies?
Yeah,
Okay.
he wrote
Sounds
one
like
that's like my personal travels and then one that's like my
okay.
professional work. And
Yeah.
they're both really, really rich and very interesting.
Yeah, he seems fascinating and like he was shaping the world as he was going through it.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
awesome. I'll just mention before we sign off, for any of you who are in this region, we are having a really special event on Wednesday, July 30th, at the Margaret Esherick House. We're having a cocktails and canapes event where you can come and listen to um, a free concert in Pastorius Park on the back patio of the Margaret Esherick House, and as well as, of course, take a tour through it and meet the homeowners and all kinds of nice things. On August 20th, we're taking our museum members up to the Michener. So if you are a member and want to join us, you'll be seeing an email coming around about that shortly. And you can always become a member and then join us if you're interested. And then Ethan, you've got a plan for next month's Spotlight Talk with the curator from the Taft in Cincinnati to talk about
Yeah.
that exhibition, yeah?
Yeah, so we're gonna have Anne Glasscock with us on Tuesday, August 26th at noon, to chat a little bit about the show in Cincinnati, Anne Glasscock's work on the Crafted World catalog, and then some hopefully interesting discussions about how this show fits into the Taft Museum of Art's collection and history, and then the larger history of Cincinnati as a hub of wood carving in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it
Um,
should be a very different look at the show.
yeah, really. I'm excited to hear more about that history in Cincinnati too. Well, thank you so much, Ethan, and thanks you everybody who came out today. We're so glad to be here with you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.